Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're here on another episode of the Lawrie Smith, John Oxley papers. And this morning, we are privileged in having former Lord Mayor Sally Ann Atkinson join us to allow us to really get into the nitty-gritty of the Japanese garden. And the reason for that is that it wasn't just the creation of the Japanese garden, which Lawrie was involved in. It was the saving of the Japanese garden that Sally Ann was involved in. And the missing ingredient between those two is a fellow called Ross McKinnon, who was the curator of the Mount Coot-tha Gardens, as it was known then, and is now known as the Brisbane Botanical Gardens. So, Lawrie, I think if we open it up to your good self first, because I had seen the plaque in relation to the sad event, but I hadn't actually realised the full implications of what had actually occurred during the process of building the Japanese gardens. So if you can just give us a little bit of background as to what exactly did happen.
Right, okay. Well, it was a great privilege, of course, to work with Kenzo Ogota, who was the landscape architect responsible for the pavilion and surrounds and so on. And he was designated, he was in his 80s, and he was designated as the Japanese living treasure because of the wonderful work that he had been doing throughout his career. And so for me, as then a younger landscape architect, to work with him and help him in finding materials and so on for the garden was quite amazing, because you would take him to various nurseries because you knew he'd been communicating what he really wanted. And of course, he'd go to the nurseries and the nurseries would show him their pristine, wonderful stock. And he'd say, no, none of that, no, something bit, with character. So we'd go around the back of the nursery and we'd find these wonderful specimens that, weren't going to be bought by anybody else. And so he'd select these. And what was wonderful, he had this wonderful little notebook, and every specimen that was going to be a very special element in the garden, he drew a very quick sketch of that, and then he used that later. And then we went to quarries, the same thing. We'd go and find the rocks that had been to one side of the quarries that were, encrusted with mosses and lichens and things, and he'd select the best ones, draw the sketches, and then later on he'd show us these wonderful little sketches that became the garden, and it was just incredible to see just how well that was. And one of the things that he wanted was some black bamboo in the garden as an important element in the entrance to the pavilion. And
black bamboo, is that Australian bamboo or is that a Chinese?
No, it's an international one. That's right. Yeah, it's commonly used in those sort of gardens in Japan and so on because of the black finger-sized stems. Anyway, I had a clump of this, quite a large clump on our acreage property, and so came out there with his staff, and he supervised the chaps digging up the individual columns of the bamboo. It's a very hot day in the middle of January, and but unfortunately that night he passed away, and it was just the heat, they said, that and not that he was doing manual labour, but just being there in a very, very hot Brisbane summer's day.
So he actually passed away after going to your property to dig up the black bamboo? That night,
yeah.
Oh, that must have been an absolute shock to you.
It was for all of us, and of course most of us who were involved attended his funeral, which was held in Brisbane, and it was a sad part of the Japanese garden, but nevertheless the garden was nearly finished, and his staff and we all of us, the landscape team from Expo, his staff, made sure that his vision was created.
Okay. Were you aware of that particular tragic event or the full details of that?
No, I wasn't. The first time I heard about it was when you told me about it, Peter, and now hearing the full story from Lawrie, yes, I'm surprised that we didn't know about it and that we didn't do something to acknowledge it.
Yes, well, there is the plaque that is sitting in the gardens at Mount Coot-tha. That is the relocated plaque of appreciation, which is March 1988. But obviously,
No, sorry, I meant I'm really sad that we didn't do something at the time to acknowledge his death, because yes, that was a tragedy, and you know, he was part of Brisbane by then, and we were part of him.
That's right.
yes, well, this is the benefit of the series and Lawrie's work, and the benefit of the information going into the John Oxley Library is that it's picking up those incredibly important threads of history. Just moving on Sally Ann, just so you can explain to us. So, I mean, everyone knows that you're really incredibly passionate about preserving the memory of and the spirit of Expo 88 when you fought to have the South Bank developed. But one of the very original steps you took was in basically saving the Japanese garden. And I'm just wondering just how Ross McKinnon, assuming that it was him personally, approached yourself in relation to that, if you can recall the details.
I don't remember if it was Ross who approached me, but it probably would have come through my office. You know, this is so. Even though I knew Ross very well through all sorts of other areas of activity to do with parks and gardens, but I always felt before Expo and during Expo and after Expo that it was absolutely vital that Expo lived on in Brisbane, that it wasn't just a one-off event that was here today, gone tomorrow, and then forgotten, because it affected so many people emotionally. So many people had such formative times at Expo, and one of the great things about Expo was that it internationalized Brisbane. Brisbane people who'd thought of themselves as a bit of a, you know, backwater in the country, perhaps apologized for coming from Brisbane. All of a sudden, the whole world was coming to Brisbane, and we were part of the international scene. And so the Japanese garden was just one way of doing something about that. And of course, the Australian-Japan Association, the connection was very important. At that time, we had a lot of Japanese investment in Queensland, on the Gold Coast, up in Rockhampton. The Japanese were very present. The Brisbane-Kobe sister city link, that was the first sister city that we had. And there's another sort of interesting link to the gardens. Most Japanese cities, when they were twinning with Australian cities, and we were going over there and gifts were to be exchanged, most Japanese cities wanted koalas. So we were thinking about the koalas. But then we were told that no, Kobe wanted lungfish. They were establishing an aquarium, and lungfish were to be part of that because they were unique, they were rare, and they came from Queensland. And we had them in the Botanic Gardens. So there was this great link with our Botanic Gardens, the lungfish and Kobe. And what's interesting, bringing it right up to the present day, the Museum of Brisbane, which Peter, as you know, I chair, has a wonderful exhibition called Storytellers, and that's it, Storytellers. And that was 9 Brisbane writers were asked to write about Brisbane, and then artists sort of interpreted all that. And one of the stories by a wonderful young woman writer is about lungfish. And when I was speaking to her, she didn't know about the Kobe connection, how important to make those links. And the lungfish and Kobe are still going strong. And because the important thing about lungfish is that you can't tell whether they're boy lungfish or girl lungfish. So we had to send enough lungfish so that little lungfish would come as a result. And they have, and the Kobe Museum has those lungfish, or the great-grandchildren, or whatever it is, of the lungfish from Brisbane and the Botanic Gardens. So that whole Brisbane, Kobe, Japan, Australia connection continued on, but the gardens, of course, are very significant.
Yes,
Right.
and that is a great story. And thank you so much, Sally Ann, for that little narrative. And we'll send the bill off to the Brisbane Museum for the promo. Now,
Of course.
what we might do here, ladies and gentlemen who are watching, is that we'll break here, and we'll come back in a second in relation to the playlist that relates to the Japanese gardeners at Mount Coot-tha instead of the Lawrie Smith, John Oxley papers. So if you just bear with us for a second,